brother and me, trial and error. We tried something that failed or didn't fail too bad, or we tweaked it. They required a certain degree of monitoring, and some of this stuff, when my brother and I, more than my brother, first got started in rotational grazing, we weren't familiar with NRCS, and we thought we knew more, and we jumped into our own planning process, and we made some mistakes along the way. And not that we're still not making mistakes, but some of this stuff was cost shared, and most of it wasn't. But the number 5 thing I got to put on there, I'm not an expert because I'm not 100 miles from home. In fact, when we go across the river, that's my home county. So, the fence. And I just put this up because I wanted a fence picture, but basically fences, there's 2 types of fences, a physical barrier and a psychological barrier. These are examples of physical barriers. What you're doing over there with the electric fence is a psychological barrier. What kind of fence do you need? I shared this with the last class. Out-of-state hunter bought this place near me. He put in 3 miles of 4-cable fence. The posts are 2 3/8 inch oil well pipe. Every 30th post is a 6-inch pipe. The ends are 6-inch pipe. He double H'd them and cemented them in. And I don't think it'd hold cattle anyway, but it looks pretty. The reason I put this H brace up and is still, and you'll see it in the next slide, but this H brace needs to be, the horizontal part needs to be at least 2, if not 2.5 times long as your fence is tall. 4-foot tall fence, that needs to be at least 8 foot, and 10 would be better. And the same thing here, they call this we call it a floater, a New Zealand type fence. I actually use oil well pipe here. I just put a lag screw in there, tie it around. These hold as much as a double H, and they're easier to put in. Once you get all these made, we've like pre-make these before we go out, wrap the wire around the bottom. I got this setting on planter opener. You can set it on a piece of wood. I just set it on a disc blade, and I haven't had any trouble with them. Yep.
Why does your floater need to be twice as long as your...
It has to do with this angle. It has to be, what's this angle need to be, Dave? Like 30 degrees or something, and that's where it gets its most strength.
30 or less, yeah. 30 or less.
And I think actually this one needs to be up here. It's a leverage thing.
How do you hook the wire to that pipe without it breaking?
What I do, well, I did 2 things. Before, I torched 2 holes in there, and I put a piece of super tube in that I'll show you in a minute. And that worked. What I started doing is we got some galvanized S-hooks, and we put and use this galvanized S-hook to hold the wire in. You've seen insulators. What is on that last fence is this stuff called super tube. This is some of the original stuff we used. You just put it in, your wire in there, wrap around the post. You can either wrap the wire or use a sleeve and compress. This stuff, it will break if you use it on a smaller, like 4-inch post. They've got stuff with a metal strap in it, and it seems to work a little better. I even had a guy that sells me electric fence said, you'll like them, but they might break on you. But I've had some in 10 years, and they haven't broke. So I like the ones with the metal strap, a little more expensive. And here's an example of one. And this is actually a plastic post, but I still used an insulator on it because people have told me these plastic posts will get their pores in them, and water will get in there and cause problems. So I used the super tube on that. 1-wire electric fence. Everybody said, and I'm digging up a little bit of dirt because when my brother first got into this late 90s, nobody said, he started out, I think the first year he had 800 head of yearlings and 300 head of cows. The next year he jumped up to 1,900 head of yearlings. And everybody said it wouldn't work. They're going to walk down more grass. That's too many cattle in one bunch. They'll kill each other. You won't be able to keep them in. This fence is running kind of towards the southwest, and it's a hard driving rain. And well, that's just a one-wire electric fence holding back 2,000 head of yearlings. And and not that we don't have problems, but once we was getting cattle, basically out of a backgrounding yard, and they'd slip through the first couple times, but once they got trained, we had no problems. Now back to electric fence not working. This was just recently. I fenced out a dam because I leased my place to a hunter. He didn't ask me to do this. I did this. This dam down here in this corner attaches to some CRP, so I thought, well, I'd fence this dam out so the cows don't get in there, because I got a portable water tank. That way the water will be there, cover will be there for calves to get back, and the one wire wasn't holding them. The calves started getting under there and they broke the wire. And the reason was it's too dry. They weren't getting enough ground. So actually on Saturday last week, before I moved them to the next pasture, I had to run another wire, the ground wire, and I fenced out another dam and I put down 2 wires to keep them out. The poly wire that you've seen, that you're working with, I guess a word of caution. Before I would come up with a great big grazing plan and talk about, people talk about wondrous things moving cattle every day. I'd say do it once or twice and try it out and see if you like it. Because I'm trying to think, Brett, I was talking to you last night about it. Even in his operation, they're probably slowly transitioning away from farming. There's still obligations to go on. And there's a quality of life thing. If you want to get up and move fence every day, that's fine. But this is one of the tools that can help. This is what kind of reel? O'Brien reel. It's a 3-to-1 ratio. It'll roll it up real fast, but you get a quarter mile of wire on there. It gets pretty heavy and kind of daunting. The poly wire I use Premier. The stuff you're using over there is Gallagher. There's a big difference in poly wire. Roger's got some stuff in the back of his pickup that's yellow and black, and you think it looks better. And they got it free. I mean, it's not knocking Roger in the deal, but it's doesn't have as many wires running through it as this Gallagher or Premier wire, and it just doesn't conduct the electricity as well.
I think that yellow's got 4 wires and that turbo wire's got 9.
Yeah. This was really important yesterday, and I don't see him in here. But if you start doing some temporary fences, don't worry about the fence being straight. And I got a slide about that. And it really come to light yesterday because I saw Ken standing on the end telling the guys how to put the posts in. What difference does it make if the fence isn't straight? It's one more thing for your neighbors to talk about. And I mean, if you get hung up on doing straight fences, it'll drive you nuts because you'll be going back all the time. Put the fence in and leave. Electric fence post. These are the O'Briens that we got over there that Leroy brought. There's some knockoff O'Briens that are knockoffs and they're not as good. The Leroy uses the fiberglass over on your left, like when he builds out in the pasture. I use steel posts, and part of the reason I use steel posts is I tore out a bunch of barbed wire fence and I got a lot of steel posts left and I use the insulators. Not everybody likes that, but I do it but to go buy a steel post now is over $5 and insulator's $50. And what's the fiberglass?
They're about $6.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about an insulator.
The reason I use the fiberglass is because I'm slightly lazy. You can tell by looking at me, and if something breaks that off, it don't ground out. Where if you pop an insulator off, the steel post will ground out. Another
trick I've done is when I'm putting in just a one-wire electric fence, I alternate the way the posts face the wire. So if they do, a deer or antelope come through and knock it off, they don't always knock the whole thing off. I don't know if it helps, but we do it. These are kind of cool, but Leroy uses them, and in the wintertime they're kind of harder to handle to get in.
Oh, no, you know how you do that?
Drill a hole.
Yeah, you take the little
I put this up, and this was this summer. I got a stretch of fence along CRP, and when it was hot this summer, you can't read that, but that fence was only 20 inches off the ground, and it was holding the cattle in. I usually have it about this high. I usually have it where it's got some sag in it between posts. I'll go 30 to 50 steps on good level ground. The one thing of keeping that wire loose like that, if you have it tight, it's like having a rubber band tight. But if you keep it loose, it's got some spring. So if something does hit it, and the other thing is you can take your four-wheeler and drive over it and you don't have to stop and open gates. Fencers, we're not supposed to advertise, but several of us in the room use Gallagher. That's a speed right fencer Leroy's got over there on the grazing exercise place. I've even used Parmax. The big thing with the fencer, if you need one, buy a bigger one. The politically correct term is you give the cattle a bite or a shock, a memorable one. Merle Moore says make them with their eyes water and buckle them to their knees and they'll remember it. Ground rods, and that's probably the problem I'm having this summer, is, this is, like they said, as dry as it's been. Ground rods. We use 6-foot galvanized ground rods and galvanized wire from the ground rod back to the fencer, or you can use them clips that come with it. But the big thing is if you use anything else, you'll get some corrosion coming, like if you use copper or something like that. One thing I forgot to mention on the wire, I use 170,000 PSI wire, and it's class 3 galvanized high tensile wire. It comes in 4,000 foot rolls. If you haven't used it, it's fun. It's all right to use, but you can't have a barbed wire mentality and use high tensile wire to a certain degree. And if you get a roll of wire, buy the spinning jenning with it, because you will never get it unrolled without it, or you'll get it unrolled, but you'll cause you grief. And you can use, there's a higher, like 210,000, and I don't like using it because it's pretty stiff, and it'll bend and it'll crack and break. So I just used the 170, which is fine, and that's what Gallagher uses or sells. Electric fencer, just a picture of a 110 fencer. Most places I'm at, I don't have that. This is a must-have. If you have an electric fence, they're $100. I wouldn't be without it. And the first group, Leroy and I built that fence last Thursday over there. We put it up, tested it, it had 9,300 volts. The first group come in, made their pins, and we checked the fence, and it was only 1.4. And this has actually got a thing on it that'll tell you where it's grounding out, and that wasn't working, but we kept checking it. We had to go back and find, and it was all Dave Steffen's group fault. They ran a wire across the ground wire, and it was not working, and we found it. If we hadn't had this, we wouldn't have known it was working. Saves you a lot of grief.
Just checking you out, Judge.
What?
Checking you out.
I'm going to switch to water. How much water do you need? This tank needs quite a bit. This tank don't need too much. NRCS, when they do their planning, if you're doing a grazing system and planning, these are the figures they use. Pair, 18 gallons, replacement heifer, 15, horses, 18, lambs, 3 gallons, and we've got to remember this is a 1,000-pound cow. They're referring this back to an AUM, which is a 1,000-pound cow. So that's where they get some of their figures. They don't make it up. I just Googled this when I made this slide, and basically what I found on the internet, varying degrees, I saw them same figures. Up to high is 24 gallons, but I think that might have been a dairy cow. The replacement heifer was the same. Sheep was a half gallon more. The producer tells me that if you're hauling water, that they take 36 gallons a day. But that's another. I'll tie that in a little bit later. In perspective, if them calves over there right now weigh, what's the consensus of the group? 5.5, maybe, if that much. So even if they're drinking 10 gallons, they should be drinking 130 gallons a day over there, and they haven't done it. I mean, and I don't know why. They just haven't. Maybe it's a change of water or something, but they're not drinking as much as they quote-unquote should be.
Starving.
Maybe they're getting a lot of water from the grass. Dams and dugouts, they're fine, but the next picture is why I don't like them. This isn't on my place, by the way. This is a problem I see with them. Dams and dugouts would be fine if you'd restrict the access. And I don't do it on my place, but I've seen some people, they restrict it, and they put in like a rock ramp that they can go down, and the wire, they make a floating system for the wire out in there so the cattle don't get in there. On my place, I use all piped water, so I don't have to worry about it. And I'm fortunate to be close to rural water, too. So, fortunate. Back to the hauling water. Can you haul water? There's probably people in this room that have hauled water, I know. I haven't, but it comes with its own issues, too. When designing a grazing system, and that calls for pipe or something like that, and the reason I bring up this 1.25 pipe, personal experience, this is what my dad put in 30-some years ago when he ran water from where I live now to where he lives now. He just used the 100-pound pipe, and we had a well and didn't worry about it. Well, I switched to rural water, more pressure, and then I ended up having a leak. In one month, I went through 100,000 gallons of water in 2006, and nothing surfaced. It took me about basically over a year to find it. We just had to put in curb stops and let stuff build, let the pressure build up and finally find it. But, if he would have put in the higher pressure pipe, the 160, he wouldn't have had it. So the big thing is if you're doing a grazing system or planning water for a system, if the plan calls for 1.25, go to 1.5. Calls for 1.5, go to 2. I know one producer probably runs 400 head of cows. I think he had a Great Plains contract, ran 1.25, 1.25 line. He had 5 herds at that time. It worked. He's amalgamating his herds, and now he's running another pipeline right beside the other one because he don't have enough water. Above ground pipe. This is, and I wish I had a sample, 160 PSI black plastic pipe. It's 1 inch. The thing I like about it, it's pretty flexible. It'll take some abuse. If you want to kind of dip your toe into moving some water around, you can put up electric fence, run it. This pipe will get hot the first year, like terribly hot, but the second year that grass grows over it and shades it. These couplers are a compression type fitting. They don't pull apart. They call this the riser. Water's there, you stick the key in, you've got water, so it's a pretty flexible system. Specifications, once again, this is what NRCS does when they design a grazing system. They want you to have a day's storage, but you got to have recharge. If you have enough recharge, that'll be less. And protect the water and inlets, protective boards, the livestock escape or wildlife escape routes, things like that. That's things they do to protect them on the money they put into your system. This is what I use on my place. It's a 10-foot tank. I used to have it on skids. I put it on wheels now because the skids were making it into a tillage tool. This actually kept up with 80 to 100 pairs. But the problem I had is when I moved to this particular pasture, there's probably 100 foot of lift here. And with that black plastic pipe and the rural water, I didn't have enough pressure. So didn't have enough pressure to keep my recharge wasn't sufficient. So that's why I had to go to this. Just a picture of it in use. I guess take a notice of this water level, and I will come back to that. The thing that sucks about having a movable water system is that when it rains or it's time to move, you got to move. And this was after a 3-inch rain. This is back when I had that skids on it, and I couldn't pull it with the four-wheeler empty, and so this is what I had to do and muck up my pasture. This is something my brother come up with. Is just a 20-foot feed bunk we put wheels on. We've used 2 of these to water 2,000 head of yearlings. But our recharge was sufficient enough that we could do it. It wasn't all summer long, but it was just a cluster of two pastures where we set it up. So it worked for us and got us through. Donnie Garrity, this is actually the bottom of a hay feeder, and he actually had the people that make the hay feeder made this. Is this yours, Pat? Yes. This is Pat Guptill's watering system, and he put in a creep area for the calves. You can talk to him, but I'm guessing water is cheaper than creep feed. This is a thing we did on our place, was got these reservoirs, they're old fuel tanks. They used to set on the south side of the interstate in Vivian. There was construction work going on. We gave a construction worker $200, borrowed the company payloader, tipped him over, borrowed my cousin's hay truck that didn't have lights, license, or insurance, and hauled them home. And then we had no way to set them back up, so they set like this. And we cleaned them out. My brother actually, he was the only one that could fit in this hole. That was the good part about being chubby. He cleaned them out, and then we could fill them with 1.25 inches. My brother's got a flowing well, and he knew what his grazing plan was going to be. He could go ahead and start filling them, like in March and April. And then come when the yearlings were making around, we could pull out of it. And right here you can see 2-inch lines, and that's what we use to water them yearlings. This is another thing we come up with. I saw it in an HRM newsletter. We called it a chicken water. We didn't have to put the lid on it, but this was 7,500 gallons. It has a trough all the way around it. It had 6 or 7 floats around the outside, and it worked fine, but the problem we had is we couldn't drain it, get it moved, and get it back up before the cattle would enter. And sometimes we'd have to move this, 3 miles, and the cattle only had to move, a next pasture over. So he has started going to more bottomless tanks. This particular was one of his first ones. He used cement. He goes to, they got a liner in them, so we don't have to, they're a little cheaper and don't have to have the concrete. Recovery time. Many livestock numbers can be watered out of a tank provided there's quick recovery. And sometimes you've got to make your tank a little bit smaller, and it goes back to the trust issue. They will wait in line to drink if they trust the water is there. The trust has to be earned. The water wreck thing, avoid it. They told me, and I can't remember who they is, they said if cattle have a water wreck, it takes them 2 weeks before they trust you again, which goes back to the guys hauling water. If there isn't water all the time, that's where they're getting that 36 gallons because they don't know that there's going to be water. They require monitoring and adequate storage. Back to my water center up here. See the level in there? What we have observed is cattle will come into a pasture, they'll go clip grass, come around. If they come to this water tank, they stick their nose in, they don't bottom out, they'll take a sip and move on. If they stick their nose in, hit bottom, they start turning their head sideways, they won't move, they'll slurp, and they're going to take their stuff before the next person. Another thing, when you move a portable tank, it helps if you shut the valve on the bottom of the trough. So like when it's been running for 2 hours before you get back there, it fills up. Back to the fence and everything. If your neighbors think you're nuts, you must be doing something right. When my brother first started running all these yearlings, and I told this story last time, there was a neighbor went and checked with our insurance agent to make sure we had insurance before we turned the yearlings out, because they knew they were going to get out. Thought to go home on. Never be afraid to try something new. Remember, a lone amateur built the Ark. A group of professionals built the Titanic. Lone amateur was probably driving the Ark. A professional was driving the Titanic, too. Most people would rather fail conventionally than succeed unconventionally.